Hello there, and a warm welcome. We're back with the latest edition of the Digital Foundry Direct Weekly Q&A show. Plenty of interesting topics to get through this week. As always, joining me first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, a very busy Q&A and a very busy week for us, as I'm sure our audience will soon discover, or perhaps it's already discovered, depending on the publication schedule of this particular video.
Indeed. And of course, John Linneman, hello. You're joining us just before you set off for Gamescom 2026.
That's right. Heading out bright and early in the morning. A lot of good stuff to look forward to. Some cool meetings, cool games to see. I always love Gamescom. So I'm a little bummed out that you couldn't make it this year, but maybe next time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Same with Alex as well. But usually it's you and Alex, and the three of us get up to no good. And this year it's just me. So... and the people I'm driving up with, one of them is hanging out in the background. So if you see somebody back there, don't mind them.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I did enjoy last year where basically I ended up getting a heavy cold and had to basically segregate myself from you for the last day. That was fun, wasn't it?
Oh, right. That, yeah.
Okay, well, before we crack on, let's take a look at this. This video is sponsored by MSI. To mark the launch of Onimusha Way of the Sword, MSI has a new hardware promotion running right now. From August 14th through to October the 4th, purchasing an eligible MSI MPG gaming monitor lets you redeem an exclusive Onimusha game code. Two standout models are leading this campaign. First is the MPG 341 CQR X36, the world's first 34-inch ultra-wide 360Hz QD-OLED. It features a 5th generation panel with a new RGB striped sub-pixel layout that massively improves text clarity. Alternatively, the MPG 322UR X24 delivers a pristine 32-inch 4K image at 240Hz with a 0.03 millisecond response time, utilizing 4th gen tandem architecture for increased efficiency. Both displays deliver the vivid covers and ultra-fast responsiveness needed for a game like Onimusha. They also utilize dark armor film to enhance black levels alongside uniform luminance to maintain consistent screen brightness during rapid transitions. To participate, share your battle experience and submit your proof of purchase. Quantities are limited, so click on the link in the video description below to check the full eligible model list and claim your code. Okay, so the first question we've got for this particular edition of the show, well, it's actually two in one. They're basically asking the same question. We're going to kick off with this one from Just Plain Mike. You keep talking about the portable PlayStation and the PS6 as separate things, but maybe the portable thing actually is the PlayStation 6. The idea here is that, one, most gamers don't care at all about graphical improvements above the PS5, as you've discussed at length. The other, two, the only way to make a PS6 even slightly affordable is to make it low spec. And three, with the Wii U to Switch transition, there's already a track record of a company successfully doing a same-powered portable as the successor to a fixed console. Sony could then, a few years later, release a more powerful and expensive fixed console, the thing that everyone expects the PS6 to be today, as the PS6 Pro, where the niche audience that cares about graphics would be okay paying high-end money for the extra horsepower. Crazy theory, or so crazy it might just work. This is followed up with a question from Dan Turismo. I'd love to see his birth certificate. Hey DF crew, you said on a recent DF Direct that console SoCs are decided years in advance, and so it's hard for companies like Sony to pivot in response to rising component costs. Could Sony instead opt to shelve Orion and release Canis, the rumoured PlayStation handheld, as the PlayStation 6, effectively following Nintendo's playbook? A lower-powered target with cheaper memory could help keep the console affordable while still offering PlayStation players something new. It could also help to stop development budgets from ballooning any further, and maybe even help them explain away the lack of future disc support. Curious to hear your thoughts. John, I'm going to go to you first on this one, because obviously I think you mentioned in the last Direct, we've heard some things about the PlayStation portable handheld thing going back 2 or 3 years now. What do you think about this idea?
I actually like the idea, but I don't think that's what they're doing. Canis is a separate product. And I think there's also some problems with that, given what we know about its specs and what's even possible right now, in that when they made the jump from Wii U to Switch, the Tegra X1, I guess, could technically produce visuals that outperformed what was possible on Wii U. And that's the Wii U was somewhat underpowered. So that was kind of like a lateral move with some slight upgrade. I don't think you could make a handheld that could support like PS5 Pro, especially, but even necessarily PS5 level performance realistically at the size they want with like a battery. I think there's too many things that would make that really, really, really difficult to pull off. And I don't think it's going to be that. And so I don't think they would sell a PS6 that's a portable that is less powerful than the current console.
Right.
I think it would be a tough sell. And so I don't think they're going to do it. But I do like the idea of them shifting towards that sort of model. And I feel like that could indeed solve some problems. It would explain the lack of discs. It would explain, or it would help them in territories like Japan where there's been faltering. So there's definitely potential there. I just don't think that's what they're going to do. And I also think that on the cost side, when you say cheaper memory, I don't know what that memory is, because I don't think there's any.
It's less of it.
Yeah, it's less memory, I guess, but they're kind of hamstrung on what the minimum is they could get away with. And there is no memory that's fast enough to support games. There is no cheap version of that right now. So there's really no way to save money on that. Same with the storage stuff. So like, there's really nowhere to go on there to save money. And I also don't think it would necessarily shorten up or reduce development budgets, because at this point, the hardware is all kind of similar to what it's all kind of in this similar class. And the bottleneck and the cost of making this stuff isn't going to change dramatically with more hardware at this point. We've already kind of reached the point where it's just very expensive if you're aiming for that top quality. And I don't think it gets more or less expensive to a significant degree at this point, given what we know about scaling hardware up.
Yeah, Oliver, I mean, I guess the theory here is that, I don't know, do you think people have been, quote unquote, glazing the capabilities of the PlayStation, upcoming PlayStation handheld? Because there is the sense that, people kind of like are expecting like a portable PS5 or something like that. And in that sense, it would be a lateral move. And a device that's kind of the same, but with more modern features, machine learning features, for example. And yeah, it could be a replacement of sorts. I don't know. I don't see it, bearing in mind the power budgets.
I think the hope would be that it could achieve a PS5-like experience. So when you combine all the new technologies that are going into it, the much better machine learning acceleration per teraflop, the much better ray tracing acceleration, I think those kinds of things would feed into it and would produce a device that possibly could compete with PS5. In some limited respects, obviously the hardware would be much weaker, but I kind of even think that vision is maybe not something we're going to completely see, especially when you consider like the low TDP at which a device like this will have to ship at. In terms of the whole cost saving question, I completely agree with John. The issue here is much more fundamental than just scaling up or scaling down a chip design, which is what we've seen in the past, because probably for a PS6 handheld, you'd probably want at least 16 gigabytes of RAM for the purposes of playing older titles, right? PS6 titles, PS5 titles, whatever. Probably you'd want 16 gigs. Maybe you could get away with 12. I don't know if developers would be scaling down their games to the point where that would be realistic, but 16 gigs plus maybe 512 gigs of storage, 500 gigs of storage would be reasonable. And in that universe, you're putting a considerable outlay onto the table in terms of memory and storage from the very beginning. That same memory and storage outlay caused Valve to increase the price of their Steam Deck to like $800, right? So it's not something that is a trivial cost. It's actually a very large cost. The SoC might be smaller, but the unit itself has to have a display, has to have a battery, has to have other components. You're not necessarily getting that big cost savings. And I think you see that currently in the PC handheld market where, the prices of a lot of these PC handhelds are pushing at above $1,000 for good capabilities. That could, I'm not going to say that's the case for the PS6 handheld, but I don't think it's going to be a cheap device either. And yeah, ultimately, I don't think that's the way to go. I think what you want with the PS6 is a device that someone can look at and confidently say, this is a much better experience that I'm getting with my PlayStation 5, or a significantly better experience that I'm getting with my PlayStation 5 Pro. I think you want to be pushing in that direction. And if pushing in that direction means $1,000 console, $1,100 console, I think it's better to bite the bullet and actually achieve something that is a meaningfully powerful system than go down this route of just this low-cost box that's weaker than your PS5. I don't think that's necessarily what people want. I think an aspirational device is better than a device that is just not up to snuff, is my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've been thinking about really is release dates, because I don't think they can release both at the same time. I think that would be a really, really bad move. I mean, I'm reminded of when they did PSVR and PS4 Pro pretty much at the same time. It was logistically extremely difficult for Sony. It also meant that the dedicated PlayStation users were having to kind of like shell out twice on significant pieces of hardware in the same time frame. And I do think it is probably the case that it would make more sense to do the handheld first and then push out whatever the release date is for the proper PlayStation 6 a bit further on, maybe even a year down the road. That might make sense, at least 6 months. I'm not sure the extent in the current market as to which that will able to make a meaningful impact on stuff like pricing or whatever. But I do think that, when just talking about the PlayStation Portable and the PS6 as being one and the same thing, that's definitely not the case. We can rule that out. They are very much two separate devices that are in development with Sony at this time. So, yeah, interesting sort of situation facing Sony here in that, well, Microsoft have obviously got to contend with the concept of selling one expensive device, and the way things are going, Sony might have to contend with selling two. Double jeopardy. How are they going to do it? I don't know. I guess they do have more leeway in terms of subsidized pricing, bearing in mind what's happening with the end of discs. They're probably assuming that any dent to revenues are probably going to be quite minimal by removing the physical option, which might give them more revenue leeway to subsidize devices. I don't know. None of us really knows. Any final thoughts, John?
No, I mean, obviously there's a lot we're waiting for, and Sony themselves said they haven't committed any dates, and it seems like the Canis handheld as well has been pushed back quite a bit. It's been floating around for a while, and it seems like a difficult one to get made. So but whether that it works or not, there's just so much we don't know. It's really going to come down to how they position this in the market and what they market it as. If they tried to do, say, a PSP2 equivalent, I don't think it would work.
So my final thought on this, the thing that's been bothering me about the PlayStation handheld for some time now, I mean, the leaked specifications are talking specifically about a 15-watt TDP, right? Which obviously we are expecting this processor to be on a new process node, like 3 nanometer. But, the extent to which there's going to be like massive efficiency gains via RDNA 5 and this new process, is it enough to deliver like a PlayStation 5 level experience? I'm not sure. And there have been lots of discussions about the handheld configuration kind of like being trialed with PlayStation 5 Eco mode.
Oh, no, the Eco mode, right.
Yeah, and John, can we say this? Our sources are kind of suggesting that they are two very different things and shouldn't be confused with one another.
Yeah, I mean, the Eco mode, as I understand it, was more of like an
EU-friendly move, right?
Yeah, something like that. And it was originally like media mode or something. It was not specifically architected for this. It may have some utility with it, possibly, but I don't think that was the point of it originally.
Yeah, so, I think it's going to be a great handheld, and potentially, there is going to be the ability to port across existing games to it. And I do think there is probably a very high likelihood that it will basically run anything that the PlayStation 4 did, which I think in itself is pretty awesome. But as to whether it's a fully fledged next generation device, I think the jury's going to be out on that. Okay, let's move on. Got this question here from Buzz B. Spoke. Hey, dear Fs, with all the discussion about people expecting too much from their components settings-wise, could you imagine a shift in naming helping with that? Like how Avatar hides some settings behind unobtainium. Maybe rename high to fidelity, medium to performance, low to potato, and ultra to DF benchmark megatron. Well, I think we've sort of discussed this sort of thing before, and famously, when Crisis 2 came out, it didn't have low settings. Basically, low became like medium or something like that. It was hilarious. But that changed again with Crisis 3, where I think they went back to the sort of expected. I think, Oliver, the issue is really that the Ultra on one game doesn't really correspond to the performance profile of Ultra on another game, even if it's running on the same engine in many cases. So, yes, I think there is much to be said about being able to change the naming to be something more informative to the user. But ultimately, it does seem to be sort of expected behavior from many people that, you just load up a game, whack it up to whatever the highest setting may be, and if it doesn't work, it's unoptimized.
Yeah, I don't really think it comes down to what the naming structure is, because I think people will just whack games up, like you said, to whatever the highest end setting is, regardless of the name. I think it's a matter of the character of what those settings actually are. So going to your like ultra or cinematic preset or whatever, if it means using presets that are really intended, like in UE5 titles, the cinematic preset for offline rendering mostly, or at least they're not really intended for playable real-time performance on modern graphics hardware, contemporary graphics hardware, even high-end contemporary graphics hardware, I think that's a bit of a miss, because if you look at the trajectory of PC hardware advancement, we're not going to see in the next few years hardware that's going to realistically deliver those games at high frame rates with those very, very high-end settings that are not really appropriate for real-time usage on current hardware. I don't think we're going to see, realistically, for a long time, hardware that's able to actually deliver high-end settings in many games that are being released today at, frame rates that gamers are expecting at 60 FPS, at 120 FPS, depending on the game, with good image quality, things like this. So I would just say that in general, I kind of think developers should just calibrate their settings to what gamers realistically on current hardware, maybe not just current like low-end or mid-range hardware, but current hardware can expect to actually get a good experience out of those games. I also think there's maybe some utility to going the Kingdom Come Deliverance route and just delivering like high or ultra settings that aren't that impressive, that might have shadow resolution or, any number of settings that might be equivalent in other games to medium settings, that they're ultra settings. I don't think that's like a totally unjustified way to go either, because I think that definitely people get so much attached to the names when all the names imply is relative positioning compared to other names, but you don't know the underlying settings that are actually going into that cauldron, that mix of presets that developers are supplying to you under some preset label. So I think it's just a matter of, calibrating expectations with the user base. But I do think there is a bit of a problem at the moment with games maybe shipping settings that they possibly shouldn't be shipping, and maybe that avatar route is the right way to go. I'm not quite sure. But in many cases, they don't provide the utility to gamers that I think they're expecting.
Yeah, so John, we got a recent example of this where Gears of War E-Day has ludicrous settings, which the name suggests it's kind of like you really shouldn't be using this, but it's there because we want to, scale the game into the future. But people are still wrapping it up to ludicrous and saying an RTX 5090 can't cope with this. It's kind of like, is there a way to make this work?
Gosh, that's such an interesting thing, because if you go back to classic PC gaming, this was a thing and people enjoyed it, but it seems like it's causing people's brains to melt in the modern era, and I'm not sure why. Like, it shouldn't be weird that they said. I guess the difference here, though, is that you don't necessarily get a gigantic tangible benefit for those settings, and it's hard to really appreciate them in the same way as it was in the past. But
right.
I do think this is all just a psychological problem, and that's what the developers have to solve: is how do you offer settings without making people feel bad about their computer? Because that's what it comes down to. That's why a lot of people want to put up their settings.
Right.
Especially these days, where again, like, the settings usually don't have nearly the same impact on visuals that they used to. Like, when you go to Crisis, there was talk about the psychological aspect of the naming conventions, but there were actual, like, genuine, tangible differences to going up in the settings significantly that really altered the visuals. And if you played Crisis on the lowest settings or even just like medium settings, it looked significantly different than the higher settings, especially with the DX10 render. It was so it was an interesting time. People wanted those settings. But you're right, like, there is a subset of people that just want to thwack it up to max settings, especially if they're on an expensive card. But sometimes those settings aren't really very performant on any existing hardware, and they're more like exposed for future stuff. And I think Ubisoft did this really well. I think it was Avatar, where they had beyond normal settings, but you had to sort of unlock it in a way. So they didn't. It was like an I edit or something like that, where you could do it if you wanted, but anybody that would go to those lengths to do it is somebody that would probably understand the limitations of it. And I think that's kind of key, is maybe if you want to expose those ultra high end settings, that it would make sense to kind of put them in a slightly different way, at least early on. Because it's just about getting hung up on the language. And I'm always surprised today when you drop games down to like medium or something, as they would often call it, and it doesn't really look appreciably worse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you should mention Avatar, because Buzz B Spoke talked about it in his question, and I actually sort of auto-corrected his point there. He was saying like how Avatar hides some settings behind unoptimum.
Oh,
it's actually unobtainium. Okay. So I kind of swapped in unobtainium there, but it's quite funny that.
So sorry, and the question it's written in lowercase, like I was thinking of like an avatar, not the game Avatar.
I just love the way it's unoptimum.
And now it's unoptimum. So yeah, the whole text here is messed up.
it makes sense though. I'm quite keen on potato settings. That would be hilarious, but it does actually have to be potato stuff. Like I remember back in the day, there's like some Final Fantasy 15 mods where it looked like a bunch of cereal boxes running about. That's kind of like how I consider potato settings. But you're quite right, Johnny, that you're quite right, Johnny, that it is the case that hey, guess what? Medium settings isn't actually that bad. And then when you look at something like Alan Wake 2 and the performance mode equivalent settings, the console equivalent settings there, it's actually lower than low in a couple of respects. Right. And guess what? It still looks good. I mean, not as great as the higher settings, of course, but it's acceptable. How do you tell the user that, though? Are they even interested? I don't know. We're doing our best with optimized settings, though. Let's move on. Question here from Drain Cell. As graphics approach diminishing returns, what becomes the new frontier for gaming? If photorealism stops being a meaningful benchmark, where does the culture of quote-unquote pushing boundaries go creatively and experimentally? When people stop caring about anecdotal changes in visuals, what happens to Digital Foundry? That's an interesting question, isn't it, Oliver? Because we've kind of almost reached it from a certain angle in that, obviously, back in the day, we did a lot of platform comparisons between PlayStation and Xbox. And we've reached the point now when certainly when dealing with Series X and PlayStation 5, 9 times out of 10, like 9.5 times out of 10, doesn't really matter which one you play it on. They both look pretty good, right?
Yeah, like the kind of bread and butter of DF comparisons. I mean, when I started paying attention to Digital Foundry, probably in 2008, 2009, was these kind of console comparisons where you'd see very significant differences between PS3 and 360. Oftentimes, the point of analysis was looking at, relative performance. Certainly, pixel count was very, very important. Pixel counting was very, very important because oftentimes there was a very large difference in pixel count, and oftentimes it meant a very large difference in the actual rendered output of the game, how it would appear on screen, right? Nowadays, that's much less true. I think we tend to look at games much more holistically, much more kind of like big picture discussion of overall rendering systems in games and things like that, instead of some of these more minute details, because that actually informs coverage and informs how games look much more than 600p versus 608p versus 720p, whatever, right? That certainly matters much more. So I think we'd probably just do that kind of stuff more and more. I think we'd increasingly move into that direction. I think there are obviously areas in games that you could still explore, even under a paradigm where you're generating photorealistic visuals. And I would argue we're kind of there today in some respects. I mean, within UE5, you can depict some scenes at extremely high fidelity. Show me a rocky crag. Show me a photorealistic rock. You can do that in UE5. A lot of UE5 games look incredible in static environments, absolutely amazing in static environments. But you start to add simulation to them. What about depicting a realistic flowing river or realistic flowing hair? Much, much harder kinds of challenges. So I think we'd start looking at those kinds of challenges, and also how that bleeds into gameplay systems, destructible environments, physics-based destructible environments. Could you do that at a realistic, high-fidelity experience? I think that'd be really exciting. But it also kind of challenge this assumption here that we're looking necessarily for photorealism, because that's often not the target, right? It's a kind of heightened, pleasing reality with lighting that enhances depth and contrast and produces interesting cues. And that's why you see so many games linger on like sunrises and sunsets and twilight evenings and interesting lighting conditions. So it's much more about trying to produce interesting, evocative, exciting game visuals than trying to achieve photorealism per se, even in games that might otherwise be trying to achieve realistic visuals. Like look at Gears E-Day, for instance, in the material that's been published so far. It is not photorealistic, but it's also not trying to be photorealistic, right? It's trying to be visually pleasing. And a game like Halo Campaign Evolved, I would argue, is in the same ilk, where it's trying to achieve very pleasing visuals as opposed to necessarily photorealistic visuals.
Right. Okay. Here's my point to you there, John. Basically, a good game experience and a graphically pleasing experience goes far beyond, stuff like photorealism and stuff. It's about actually what's happening. And I do think that certainly across the last few generations, the concept of great physics has kind of been left by the wayside. And so there's ways to push boundaries in ways that aren't really necessarily related to poly count, past face lighting, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, there's so much room to grow here and so many ways to explore that haven't been. I think interactions in general and physics and all that sort of stuff is still something I love. And that's a tricky one, both from a gameplay design standpoint and also just from a technical standpoint. But when you play a game that really focuses on that and has a lot of those things, even if the visuals are somewhat simple, like you look at something like Teardown, it's still very pleasing to experience that and see how it all plays out, just for the tech alone, even if you're not even playing the game. And that really got me thinking about just the look of a game in motion is often more important than what the core visuals are doing up close. Like so I can talk about it here since this will be going up after embargo, I think, which is tomorrow as of recording. But I played through the Gears E-Day campaign preview, and it is gloriously impressive. The level of detail is off the charts, but it's also like I kept going. I was like, this is amazing. But then I compare it to my time playing Gears 5, and it feels much closer than I expected compared to like going from like Xbox 360 Gears to something like Gears 5. This feels very much like a small iterative jump, even though technically speaking, the level of detail on display is significantly higher and the lighting is far more nuanced. And it's not a knock on that. It looks awesome, but they focused in on more granular interactive stuff and more physics stuff and like breakables, which does bring the game to life more. And I realized that that's the stuff that kind of stood out to me a little bit more than just the raw visuals, because your brain just kind of filters and gets used to the visuals. But every time you see like a cool little interaction or some kind of breakable stuff, those are the things that stick out more. And I think games that embrace that and try to do more with that is something I want to see more of in the future, for sure. And like you said, like visuals aren't just about photorealism at all. And the stories that we tell, I've done this for years. Like, it's true, we used to focus on platform comparisons, but I've moved away from that. I'd say for the most part, I don't really find that interesting anymore for new games, because they are so similar. It's just like the same game running with slightly different settings across different machines, and it's not exciting to look at anymore. So I like to look at more how something else was achieved, or just muse at the beauty of a game that's artistically and technically attractive and satisfying, because I find that stuff very appealing as well. When it comes to the nuts and bolts of making things, I still like, that's one of the reasons I like doing the retro stuff, because they really had to come up with very creative solutions to big problems. And a lot of those problems have been somewhat solved now. So it feels a lot more, it's basically about refocusing on the things that we find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I still think there's a lot of stuff growing in that area where there's just new stuff being attempted. That's really cool to look at. And I want to see more of that. So yeah, and it's also got me. I've also thought a lot about games in genres that are established versus trying new things. And I think it's cool to see ambition and like new ideas, but I actually don't think that's the most important, because when you really look at the number of games out there, there's not actually that many that I would say truly nail every aspect of what they set out to do. And by that I mean, just when you pick up a controller and something truly great, like I go back to something like Super Mario World still. Like it's an old game now, but compared to nearly every other game on Super NES, it's still like it just feels so good just to move that character and jump and perform those actions. And I like this idea of developers focusing on and making sure that the core actions feel perfect. If you can nail that, you can make something really exciting. Like the second you pick up the controller and you start running and you don't feel anything about that movement, even if you do nothing else, you just run forward. The really best games make even the simplest things feel great, where you want to do that action. And then you layer in everything else and it becomes a classic. And not that many games actually pull this off. So I still think there's a lot of room to grow there. And I would like to see more focus on just nailing existing ideas, but at the highest level, which is, of course, it's very difficult, but it's an area that I find interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good stuff. Question here from Scully. Hello, independents! Exclamation point. This is perhaps a John joint. So is there merit to the quote-unquote plasma is the next CRT movement? There's a growing number of people online expounding upon the benefits of plasma, particularly for PS360 games. The argument being that their funky rectangular pixels at 720p have a sort of native anti-aliasing that makes the lower-res games look good, and that their color rendering and motion handling is phenomenal, which supposedly helps out those low frame rate generations. I figure who better than the pioneers of the new CRT renaissance to weigh in. Cheers! Exclamation point. John, well, I had a lot of great experiences with my Pioneer Plasma back in the day during the PlayStation 3 and 360 era. Not sure I'm a massive fan of some of the arguments I'm seeing here, however.
I have mixed feelings on this as well. I was a heavy plasma user as well, and I still have a Pioneer Plasma here, in fact. And when they say it's the next CRT, I can see some purpose behind this. Now, things like motion clarity on a plasma, it's not as good as a CRT, but it's actually much closer than a normal sample and hold panel without some sort of black frame insertion or strobing. That obviously is a different thing, but just the native sample and hold displays like OLED and LCD, they're so much blurrier in motion than a plasma. But a plasma also still has some slight trailing compared to compared to a CRT. But this idea of using the lower resolution pixel grid actually does have some merit, I found. And one example is actually more recent, where I was playing. It was 2 or 3 years ago now when Final Fantasy VII Rebirth came out. If you remember, the initial PS5 version had a very ugly performance mode. It just looked very blurry and soft. I fired it up on a 1080p plasma, and Mark was actually visiting at the time, and we were both stunned by how much better it looked on that versus a 4K OLED. Like there was just this like very clean pixel delineation that made everything seem like, oh, now the difference between this and this is now very, very sharp instead of that blurry, smeary look. It completely changed the characteristics of the image, and it looked awesome. And so it's true, like sometimes content can sort of benefit from that lower pixel count, and not just the lower pixel count, but the way subpixels on a plasma look is very different compared to an LCD. They actually use a phosphor-based screen as well. So it has a unique look. And there's sub 720p. Rich remembers this. There's 1024 by 768 plasmas. Anything that was like 42 inch and below, for a while, they were doing lower resolution. And they're actually not wrong about this. The way that the filtering, or however they do it, the scaling, the result is kind of like free anti-aliasing in a way. It gives it this like slightly smoother look, but it's still sharp. I remember some of Panasonic's plasmas from 2006. Even the 1024 by 768 ones, those supported 1080p input. So you could input a 1080p signal and it would essentially downscale it to the screen's native resolution. So if you played a native 1080p game like Ridge Racer 7 on there, you basically did indeed get like free anti-aliasing, and it looked very sharp. And it really helped mitigate problems with those sub 720p games that were very common during that era. And it made them look a lot sharper, I would say. So there
isn't that double scaling? Because the console would be scaling out and then the display would be scaling down.
It was double scaling, but it actually looks okay. The screen is just has a different, again, it has to do with the way the subpixels are presented and the way the plasma like grid looks. I don't know why, but despite being a fixed pixel display, it does tend to handle this stuff in a way that's very different and yet still somewhat pleasing. The only downside to plasmas, though, well, there's a couple. One, on some models, there's like a visible PWM noise where it's almost like a grainy effect. It's like it's sparkling in the dark shadows. CRTs absolutely don't have this. And plasma black handling, like low light, very dim stuff, nowhere near CRT quality either. Like they kind of clip at a certain point, or cut, I guess, where it just can't handle below a certain level. Like they were better than LCDs in that regard, but it was still nowhere near CRT. And then if you really wanted good black levels, it was only the last 2 years or so of like Pioneer's final generation Kuro plasma and some of the later ones. They had amazingly good contrast that's still competitive today, but older plasmas absolutely did not. So they were very bright and glowy. And it's a shame because there's some interesting ones out there. There's this one, a friend of mine has a Pioneer from like early 2000s that is a 640 by 480 pixel 4x3 plasma. And it's huge. It's a giant 4x3 screen. And you just don't really see that. And it looks so cool. If you can pixel map a game with like 480p to that, you end up with like just a razor sharp image. But because it's early plasma, the black levels are not good and it has more issues with burn-in. So
yeah,
I don't know. So plasma's interesting. It's just that they tend to be big and heavy. Like CRTs are big and heavy, but because plasma screens were like, they took up more area in terms of like the screen size, it requires surprisingly more than a CRT would in terms of the space it occupies in your setup, just because of the size of the screen.
So, is it not the case that recent OLEDs and some of the technologies we have, like RetroTink, kind of like make this
mitigate that?
Yeah, a bit of a moot discussion.
I would say, yeah. I guess the thing is to consider, Rich, if you have a good OLED and a RetroTink, even with like the new one they just sent, like the 6X Pro or whatever, I have to check on that, which is only $250, which is an insane deal. You're still spending a lot more than if you were to like go find a plasma. Plasmas are easy to get now. They're very, very cheap. If somebody was looking for a display that was well suited to that older generation of consoles and like lower res content, you could get a plasma for like $50 or less easily. Now, if you already had a really nice OLED screen and you didn't mind ponying up for a scaler, then that would be this. That's actually what I do for. I mean, I use the RetroTink 4K for stuff like PS3 and Wii U and all that whenever I play that, because it does. You can actually create a sub-pixel LCD-like grid using that thing, because it allows you to do so much crazy customization with like the way it outputs. So you can actually rebuild like a pixel grid screen with individual subpixels that emulates the look of like a 720p screen or like a 1080p screen quite easily, and it looks amazing on there. So that is still probably the best, but plasmas, interesting. They're definitely interesting to look at, I will say, and they do have their uses, but it's not, I don't think it's ever going to be like CRT, because CRT just has some inherent advantages with motion clarity and its ability to handle just about any resolution. Like as long as the CRT can support the input, it kind of functionally doesn't have a native res because it's not fixed pixel. And that's what makes it look so awesome with old content, because you just pipe that stuff directly to it. You just get it looking correct. It looks awesome.
Mm-hmm. So, Oliver, any thoughts on joining the plasma is the next CRT movement?
No, I don't really have too many thoughts. All I want to say here is that, you know, I had a classic 768p Bravia LCD 2006 model, horrible contrast, horrible blur on it, terrible brightness, which is kind of, I don't know, to me that is kind of the canonical Xbox 360 and PS3 experience, because that's how those games really were defined to me. And the later models of LCDs obviously alleviated those concerns, and if you had an HD CRT or a plasma, certainly those concerns were much less present. But I would say that, you know, PS4, PS5 generations, those had a much better match between the display technology of the time and what the consoles were trying to output, not just in terms of the overall panel level quality features, but just in terms of actually aiming with the console output for 1080p or 4K or whatever, which were the actual pixel resolutions of those televisions at that time. It was actually very rare to have a native 720p LCD panel back in those days. Those were not common at all. I don't think they were really present in consumer televisions at all. Other kinds of display formats, I think like a DLP, you could get a 720p DLP.
DLP, you could get 720p.
Right.
But that's
basically it. I think there was also some 720p projectors, I believe, maybe later in the generation. But yeah, not LCDs at all.
Okay. Of course, John was sitting there pretty with his Sony headset with 720p panels in it.
Oh, dude, like that generation, I have this distinct memory of visiting a friend when he got some new 360 game. I think it was Fable 2. We loaded it up, and it's just like this horrendous black levels of that LCD, the smeary motion, the huge input lag, the low frame rate. It was a moment that sticks out because it really made me realize, like, we took a step back from like the PS2 era. Like when you play a PS2 game or Dreamcast or any 60 FPS game from that era on a CRT, it just feels so responsive. It's so crisp. The motion's so clean. Color's so good. We took such a downgrade. Like that pursuit of HD was not good. Like the first few years, especially with the technology of the time, we traded so much. Games became heavier and less responsive than ever. And like, the display characteristics were so much worse. And it wasn't even just the display. It's like the games themselves, those new engines they were developing, input latency just went through the roof. So everything felt like garbage compared to the previous generation for the most part. It's really wild how bad it was for a while. I mean, there's still some responsive games in those systems, but by and large, like everything was shifting towards very heavy, sluggish, laggy games that didn't look great on horrible displays of that era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Almost like a dark ages of sorts, despite more advanced silicon. Okay, let's move on. Final question here from Dajarko in brackets. Dan, what series of secret nods and winks should we look out for if either Sony or Microsoft show off a top secret future handheld to Digital Foundry behind closed doors at Gamescom? Does it actually remain secret if we're telling you about the nods and the winks? Maybe a whistle here or there. John, you're heading to Gamescom. We are likely to see some stuff that we won't be able to talk about for some time. Is there any kind of tip-off that we could give to...
No.
This is the most ridiculous question we've done in quite some time. Yes, any kind of secret messaging that could be employed here?
I don't think so, because one, we're not here to break leaks and report news in that way. Like, that's not what we do. Like, there are people that do that, and that's cool. That's just not what I don't like to do that, and that's not what we do anyway. But also, if there's something like when we saw Series S, for instance, to see it, we had to sign an NDA, right? And like, we're not going to break an NDA with a company like Microsoft. That would be the end of us in more ways than one. It is not worth it. It's not interesting. It's not worth it. And it's not going to happen.
Okay. So if there are any sort of winks or facial tics or anything like that, you're just like tired or something.
It's just being tired or a facial tic.
Oliver, I hesitate to ask. Thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't, certainly not intentionally, I don't try to communicate anything to the audience that's outside of what I'm allowed to say in my purview when it comes to these kinds of topics. But it's my experience also that sometimes when we discuss things that maybe are a little bit more sensitive or concern certain aspects of information that has not been publicly disclosed, people will try to read into every possible expression in your face, trying to divine your actual thoughts or feelings. But, I don't put much thought into that stuff. So I don't think you should either.
I do remember when I went on holiday, but did record a particular direct that people thought I was off on assignment seeing Switch 2, which I thought was hilarious. I wasn't. I was just on holiday. Just did the direct as normal. There's nothing to it. It's kind of interesting, though, that people do read in all of that sort of stuff. I mean, basically, Occam's razor basically applies to pretty much all of this sort of stuff, which is the most plausible explanation couched in reality is likely the proper one. We don't really want to go into hoodwinking the audience either. It's a bit weird. That's for sure. Yeah, the Xbox embargo from back in the day was certainly interesting. The Series S1 was basically an embargo that never expired until Microsoft said it expired. So yeah, we had to wait about 6 months on that. That was kind of crazy, but hopefully it sends a signal to the games industry that we can be trusted with stuff, right? But that's the way it is. That was the final episode, the final question, not the final episode. That was the final question, therefore the end of the show. Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it, that sort of stuff. Patreon.com/Digital Foundry. Join us, support the team, get early access to the direct, the chance to pose your questions. Lots of great stuff. Store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising wares. But that's all from us on this one. Looking forward to the post-Gamescom direct that's going to be coming up. But I think, first of all, there's the small matter of Grand Theft Auto 6 to discuss there. We've got the Netflix reveal coming later this week. Looking forward to that. Hope you are too. But for now, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.